Hey everyone, welcome to Larson in the Lab. Well, sort of. We're doing this lab that's kind of paper based, but it's about these Kaibab plateau deer population, and it's going to help you review graphing, also changing populations, and carrying capacity. So I'm going to read you some information, then we're going to talk about this graph, and then you get to answer some questions about this topic. So this is called the lesson of the Kaibab. As an introduction, the environment may be altered by forces within the biotic community, as well as by relationships between organisms and the physical environment. The carrying capacity of an ecosystem is the maximum number of organisms that an area can support on a sustained basis. The density of a population may produce such profound changes in the environment that the environment becomes unsuitable for the survival of species. For instance, overgrazing of land may make the land unable to support the grazing of animals that live there. In this activity, we're going to graph the Kaibab deer population of Arizona from 1905 to 1939, which you can see here. We're going to talk about factors responsible for changing populations and determine the carrying capacity of the Kaibab Plateau. Here's some background information. Before 1905, the deer of the Kaibab Plateau were estimated to number about 4,000. The average carrying capacity of the range was then estimated to be about 30,000 deer. On November 28, 1906, President Theodore Roosevelt created the Grand Canyon National Game Preserve to protect the finest deer herd in America. Unfortunately, by this time, the Kaibab Forest area had already been overgrazed by sheep, cattle, and horses. Most of the tall grasses had been eliminated. The first step to protect the deer was to ban all hunting. In addition, in 1907, the Forest Service tried to exterminate the predators of the deer. Between 1907 and 1939, 816 mountain lions, 20 wolves, and 7,388 coyotes, and more than 500 bobcats were killed. Signs that the deer population was out of control began to appear as early as 1920. The range was beginning to deteriorate rapidly. The Forest Service reduced the number of livestock grazing permits, and by 1923, the deer were reported to be on the verge of starvation, and the range conditions were described as deplorable. The Kaibab Deer Investigating Committee recommended that all livestock not owned by local residents be removed immediately from the range, and that the number of deer be cut in half as quickly as possible. Hunting was reopened, and during the fall of 1924, 675 deer were killed by hunters. However, these deer represented only 1/10 of the number of deer that had been born that spring. Over the next 2 winters, it is estimated that 60,000 deer starved to death. Today, the Arizona Game Commission carefully manages the Kaibab area with regulations geared to specific local needs. Hunting permits are issued to keep the deer in balance with the range. Predators are protected to help keep herds in balance with food supplies. Tragic winter losses can be checked by keeping the number of deer near the carrying capacity of the range. Now, take a look at our data here. We've made a line graph. We use line graphs when we're talking about change over time, and this is the change in the Kaibab deer population over a period of time. On this line graph, we have an x-axis. Let's wait for that to go away. We have an x-axis down at the bottom, and that x-axis, and typically in any line graph, the x-axis will label time. And this is time in years, and I've counted by every 2 years so that I could show all of the data. On the y-axis, which you can see over here, we are counting the number of deer. We're actually counting in thousands. So when you see 5, that really would represent 5,000 and going on up. I've counted every 5,000, I've put another mark. So you can see that the population of these deer have changed over time. You see it started, like the background information said, as about 4,000 deer, but it quickly rose up to about 100,000 by the year 1924, and then pretty quickly declined, and then now has been more gradual in the more recent years, like the 1930s and up to 1940. So I want you to use this information that you found in this graph to answer several questions. First, I want you to define what is carrying capacity. Then I'd like you to talk about during 1906 and 1907, what two things did the Forest Service use to protect the Kaibab deer? What did the Forest Service, the government, do in 1906 and 1907 that had an impact on the deer? Next question, were these methods successful? Use the data from your graph to support your answer as to whether or not the Forest Service did effectively protect Kaibab deer population in 1906 and 1907. Next question. Why did the population of deer decline in 1925? You notice it went from, in 1924, from 100,000, and in 1925 was down to 60,000. What happened that caused the population decline? Next question. Why do you think the deer population size in 1900 was 4,000 when it was estimated that the plateau had a carrying capacity of 30,000? If scientists or the government said that the carrying capacity was 30,000, why did it only actually have about 4,000? Something to think about. And based on your lessons that you've learned in this, what would you have done in 1915 to manage the deer herds? Once you saw that numbers were starting to increase, what could you have done in 1915 to make a difference? Also, based on what you've learned, what would you have possibly done in 1923 to take care of this deer population? Now, in 1923, that's kind of between data points here, but in 1920, you had 65,000 deer, and by 1924, you had 100,000 deer. So what could have you done between those years to manage that population so that it wouldn't have gone up so high? And finally, what do you think should have been considered the Kaibab deer population carrying capacity for the Kaibab Plateau? What should be considered the carrying capacity? Thanks so much for listening.